You know, when we think about mental health, our minds usually jump to modern therapy rooms, right? Brain scans, complex medications. But what if I told you that the very blueprint for things like cognitive behavioral therapy and our understanding of clinical depression was actually drawn up over 1,000 years ago?
Okay, so let's really dig into this. To find this blueprint, we're not going to some fancy university lab. Nope. We're going to have to travel way back in time, to the golden age of Islam.
So let me introduce you to our guide for this journey, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. Now, this guy was a true polymath, a master of geography, philosophy, medicine, you name it, living back in the 9th and 10th centuries. And while he was famous in his time for making maps of the world, it was his map of the human soul that was, well, truly ahead of its time.
To really appreciate al-Balkhi, you have to picture the world he lived in. It was this incredibly vibrant intellectual period. He studied in Baghdad, which was the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, and he wrote a lot. We're talking over 60 works. And tucked away in one of them, he laid down these ideas about mental health that were just centuries ahead of anyone else.
And here's the thing, he knew he was onto something totally new. In his big book, Sustenance for the Body and the Soul, he carves out a whole section just for psychological health. He basically says, hey, I've looked around and other doctors, they just don't write about this stuff. He saw it as this huge missing piece of medicine.
And right off the bat, he makes a connection that we kind of take for granted today. Al-Balkhi argued that your mind and your body are not separate things. He said that mental pain, psychological anguish, could actually make you physically sick. In an era where those were often seen as two totally different realms, this was, well, it was a radical idea.
But he went even deeper than just linking the mind and body. Let's take a look at his analysis of what he called sadness, which you'll see lines up almost perfectly with what we now call depression.
This is where it gets really mind-blowing. He made a distinction that is just so incredibly modern. He said there are two types of depression. The first is what we'd call situational. It's a natural reaction to something terrible happening, like losing a loved one or your job. But the second type, he said, has no obvious cause. It's this deep gloom that just appears. This is pretty much the first known description of what we now call clinical depression.
And this led him to another incredible leap. He suggested that this second type of depression wasn't just a spiritual problem, it had bodily causes. Now, okay, his science involved ideas like impurity of the blood, but the core insight that the cause was physiological was genius. And because of that, he said the treatment needed to be both physical and psychological. He was basically arguing for a combined therapy and medication approach, a full 1,000 years early.
And he didn't just stop at diagnosis either. For treating fear and anxiety, he laid out this super practical step-by-step method. First, realize the fear is an overreaction. Then, learn about what you're afraid of. And then, and this is the key part, force yourself to repeatedly face it until the fear goes away.
Sound familiar?
It should. It's the exact principle behind exposure therapy, which is a huge part of modern cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
So, al-Balkhi gave us this amazing intuitive map of our inner world. What's so wild is how his ideas really laid the groundwork for how we formally model that same world today. So let's jump forward in time and look at a modern framework that's charting the very same territory.
All right, one of these modern models is called BKM strain space. I know, it sounds pretty academic, but the idea is actually really simple. Just picture a mental landscape. Your psychological state isn't just one thing. It's a point that's always moving through this multidimensional space. So your position in this landscape is defined by a few key coordinates, like how much mental load are you under? Are you stuck thinking about the past or always worried about the future? Is your energy level high or low? Are your core beliefs flexible or totally rigid? These factors are what map out where you are at any given moment. Now, this model introduces a really fascinating concept called attractors. The best way to think about them is as deep valleys or basins in that mental landscape. When our mental state falls into one of these valleys, it can get, well, stuck. So in this view, mental illness isn't just a disorder, it's more like a stable, self-perpetuating pattern that's just really, really hard to climb out. So how does this whole framework map out something like anxiety or depression? Well, you can think of them as two of the deepest, most common valleys that we can fall into, and each one has its own unique set of coordinates. And looking at it this way reveals something so important. Anxiety and depression aren't really opposites. They're just two different ways of getting stuck. The anxiety valley is a high-energy, future-focused state. Your whole system is on overprotective high alert. The depression valley, on the other hand, is a low-energy, past-focused state. It's like a damage control system that is just completely shut down. Okay, so this is where it all comes together. We have the intuitive observations from a 10th century physician, and we have a 21st century mathematical model. The big question is, how well do they actually line up? Are they just two different maps of the exact same territory?
And wow, the connection becomes crystal clear. Al-Balkhi's advice to repeatedly face your fears, that's just a really practical way to do what the BKM model calls trajectory deformation. You're not just trying to suppress the symptoms, you're actively changing your path. You're trying to climb out of that anxiety valley.
And remember al-Balkhi's mysterious depression, the one with no obvious cause? That maps perfectly onto the modern idea of a depressive attractor. It's not caused by one specific thing. It's a stable, low-energy state that the whole system gets trapped in, for what al-Balkhi correctly figured out were physiological or bodily reasons.
Just think about that for a second. Over 1,000 years separate the intuitive genius of al-Balkhi from the complex geometry of our modern psychological models, and yet they're both drawing a map of the same timeless human experience.
Which kind of leaves us with one final big thought. If the patterns of our psychological struggles are really this ancient, and the fundamental insights on how to heal are just as old, well, maybe the path to getting better has always been there, just waiting for us to rediscover it.